thank you all for joining us for what promises to be a provocative and enlightening program. I would like to start by thanking the underwriters of the event, the Milano Foundation and the Cyrus Fund, and let me also thank a few friends who are in the audience today. Gene Kalin and Steve Nislik are both in the audience, and they are members of Milano's Board of Governors. Gene is also the chair of our Program and Placement Committee. Mark Willis, who's on the panel and who's with the Ford Foundation, is a former member of our Board of Governors and has been a real strong supporter and friend of the school for many years. The Center for New York City Affairs at Milano organized the event this morning as part of its larger mission to promote policy innovations that strengthen neighborhoods and reduce urban poverty. As many of you know, the center focuses on issues of public education, child and family services, immigrants, urban politics, and strategies for building stronger communities. How many people are here for your first time at a Center for New York City Affairs event? Good. Well, welcome. And I see many of you are return customers. The center does a great job, I think, of really bringing together broad groups of people, stakeholders, on events that are really cutting edge and issues that are cutting edge, and gets a very good dialogue going. I always learn a lot. The Milano School shares the mission of the Center for New York City Affairs and has a special commitment to the field of community development. Our school is dedicated to training the current and next generation of leaders in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, and to fostering thriving cities and neighborhoods. We provide a hands-on training ground for men and women who want to learn about community development. One of the places that we do that is our Community Development Finance Lab, and our director, Blaise Rastello, is here. He's also an alum. We've done work in the lab, and actually Martin Dunn, who's on the panel this morning, has also spoken to the lab, telling our students about his experience. So we partner with community-based organizations that need technical and financial help to get projects built, and a lot of them actually have been built. In the past couple of years, we've worked not only in New York City, but also in Newark, Camden, and New Orleans, where we're actually replicating our model over the next couple of years. So that kind of work, that on-the-ground, hands-on, applied work in communities is really typical of a Milano education. Our students take on real-life problems in urban policy and management. This school is as much about learning from experience as it is about lecture courses, readings, and seminars. In fact, last week we had a terrific event with Herb Sturz and Sam Roberts, who many of you may know, to talk about, where they talked about the book that Sam just wrote about Herb called A Kind of Genius. And we asked Herb, we said, you know, how should we be preparing our students to do the kind of work you've done in social change? And Herb said, get them out on the street. Get them out walking around and looking at problems and getting a feel for what's really going on. And so we felt really validated by his answer, which wasn't a setup, because we really pride ourselves on getting students out of the classroom as soon as possible. We joke around that we do it on day 2, after they've had one day of learning a little bit of theory. So we teach the skills that lie at the intersection of policy and implementation, and the skills managers need to improve their organizations and better serve communities in need. That combination of policy and practice really lies at the heart of a Milano education, and it prepares our graduates to be especially effective in the urban policy arena, which is where housing and community development tend to be located. Many of our graduates have moved on to impressive positions, and I'm especially pleased to note that Kate Koff, Deputy Chief of Staff to City Housing Commissioner Rafael Cestero, is a Milano graduate, as is Jess Nelson, who's here, who just became his assistant, special assistant. So now I'd like to introduce Andrew White, who heads the Center for New York City Affairs, is also one of our fabulous teachers at Milano, who will open up today's event. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. So thank you all for coming. I just want to say a few words to set up the context and also talk a little bit about what's coming up at the center. As Lisa said, the center is dedicated to learning about what works for families on the ground in the city's neighborhoods, and we try very hard to take the lessons learned by practitioners on the ground and lift them up to policy level. And you can read a great deal more about our work on our website at centernyc.org, and some of our work's out on the table out there as well. We host many programs like this one over the course of each semester. Next Thursday morning, we have a program with former Pennsylvania Governor Tom Ridge, who also served in the Bush administration as the first Secretary of Homeland Security. And he and Bob Carey, who's president of the new school, are going to speak together or discuss security in the 8th year after 9/11. The following week, on September 29th, we'll have a panel featuring Joyce Pernick of The Times, whose biography of Michael Bloomberg is to be published in a few days. So it's going to be a discussion about her book and about how Bloomberg has changed New York City politics. And now to the topic at hand. Many of us in this room have been following the evolution of affordable housing efforts in New York City for decades. New York, anybody who works in this field knows that New York is the pioneer city for community development and affordable housing. And we have an extraordinary infrastructure combining the public sector and not-for-profits and private developers that I think is unlike anywhere else in the U.S. There was a time not very many years ago when entire swaths of the city were marked by decrepit tenement blocks. And I remember seeing many of those with roofs caving in and landlords including the city of New York itself, who were unable to guarantee heat and hot water and electricity or to keep vermin at bay. And today, it's an amazing sight to walk around and see that those neighborhoods feel and look vastly improved, especially in terms of the housing infrastructure. And that's thanks largely to the work coordinated by HPD and dozens of nonprofit organizations and the banks and the private developers, some of you in this room. We're hearing stories of slippage now and of landlords falling behind on loans, of incomes declining and maintenance budgets declining. But obviously this is not 1993 or 1983, it's far from it. And yet affordability remains a huge challenge. The Federal Census Bureau's 2008 Housing and Vacancy Survey found that 27% of the city's tenants, or more than 573,000 households, were paying more than half their income in rent. In the boom years, investors and developers were buying up heretofore affordable rental properties and turning them into market rate and luxury apartments. And today, remarkably, the upswing in rents has finally stopped. In fact, for the first time in a few years, I've got a lot of students living in Manhattan, which was not true for several years there. So something's clearly changing, and I don't think their incomes are rising. But that's a pretty thin silver lining, since we all know families who are losing jobs and who are at risk of losing their homes as a result. So the current environment for affordable housing development and housing preservation is significantly different from even just 5 years ago. Property and construction costs may have stabilized, but credit is complicated, more complicated than ever. There's also a new administration in Washington, which poses some potential. But there are also issues with low-income housing tax credits, which we'll probably talk about today. I mean, if people aren't making money, they don't need tax credits to offset their taxes. So that's only a few of the changes that are on the table this morning. We've had a few changes in the program. From those of you who got the early announcements, instead of Ron Moelis and Gary Haddam, we've got Mark Willis and Martin Dunn on the panel. Gary had to go off to Germany for a Deutsche Bank meeting, and Ron had to be out of town as well. And happily, we've got a lot of depth in this field, so I'm very thankful to Mark and Martin for joining us. Commissioner Cestero has to leave a bit early today, so we've changed the format a bit from our usual panel discussion. The commissioner will speak, and then Manny Fernandez of the New York Times will ask him some questions. There will be a little bit of time at that point for some Q&A with the audience, and then we'll go to the panel. Rafael Cestero became Commissioner of Housing Preservation and Development 6 months ago. For well over a decade, he worked at the Enterprise Foundation, where he organized capital and technical support for community development projects around the country. And he brought those skills to HPD as Deputy Commissioner for Development, working with Sean Donovan from 2004 to 2007. Commissioner.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Dean Servan, for putting this on, and thank you to the New School and the Milano Institute. You know, it's actually quite remarkable, having spent part of my career traveling around the country, working in different cities around the country, in addition to my time working here in New York. It is really quite remarkable that twice in 1 week, we have had sessions that have attracted 150, 200, 250 people to come together to talk about affordable housing. You know, I dare say that if you were to put on this kind of session in almost any other city in the country, you know, you'd get 25 people to the session. And so it is really remarkable that we have not just the kind of presence and dialogue that we have around affordable housing, but we have institutions like the Milano School that have contributed so much, not just in terms of great leadership in the industry, much of which we have tried to take advantage of at HPD, but also to the thought process and to the thinking about what needs to be done and what can be done as it relates to affordable housing. And you know, this is without a doubt one of the single most important challenges that we face in this city. It has been that way for many years. As I will talk about in my remarks, that does not mean we haven't had successes. We have had plenty of successes. But the challenge of affordability, the challenge of making New York a more affordable city for all of its residents remains one of the critical challenges and public policy issues that we face in our city. You know, I am, in many ways, just on a personal note, a product of the kind of program that, that the Milano School and the Center for New York City Affairs runs here at the new school. I got started in my community development career when I was in graduate school, where I worked in a co-op program that was run by the University of Illinois. And I spent 2 years getting my master's degree, but also working as a community organizer in East St. Louis, Illinois, spending all of my time in church basements, talking to residents and putting plans together to recreate that city, which at that time was perhaps the most troubled urban center in America. So I really appreciate what you do here, Dean, and what the entire staff and faculty at the Milano School do, and to all of the students and the alumni. I think we all know that applying practice to what you learn in the classroom is the best way to learn and to gain the experience necessary to be leaders in the field. But with that, I really want to take my time today to talk a little bit about the state of affordable housing in New York City today, to talk about the mayor's new housing marketplace plan, and to talk about what our current thinking is at HPD for the future of the plan and the future of our efforts to create a more affordable New York. Since 2004, as we all know, HPD has been spearheading the nation's largest municipal affordable housing program. Our goal is to create or preserve affordable housing for over 500,000 New Yorkers, 165,000 units. It's a big number. It's a number that we all ought to hold as a goal for what we should strive to achieve and what we will achieve. We are committed to that goal, and we are committed to making it happen despite what the challenges are that we face today. It is truly a remarkable plan that is matched only in the scale and vision by the plan put forth by Mayor Koch and his team in the 1980s, which, in my opinion, literally saved our city. Now in its 6th year, Mayor Bloomberg's plan has already resulted in the construction or preservation of 94,000 affordable homes. Over the last fiscal year, which ended in June, despite the worst real estate market in decades, HPD and HDC financed 12,500 units of affordable housing for New Yorkers, putting nearly $1 billion in bonds to work and $460 million worth of subsidy. There is nowhere else in the country where this is possible today, literally nowhere. And many people thought that we would miss this goal here in New York. That we set, but we reached that milestone, and we reached that milestone because we saw opportunities where others saw roadblocks. We were the first to use recycled tax-exempt bonds, which was created in the stimulus package in Washington. We were the first in the country to use the tax credit assistance program, which helped fill gaps in tax credit projects and keep projects alive. These funding packages for the projects were funded through recycled bonds, and the tax credit assistance money were $300 million alone. You'd be hard-pressed anywhere else in the country to find one project that was financed in this environment that topped $300 million. But we put that capital to work in multiple projects and reached a scale that is only accomplishable in New York. We're very proud of our achievements. We're very proud of what we have done under the New Housing Marketplace Plan. We're very proud of what we have done in partnership with the entire industry to create affordable homes for New Yorkers. But we're not satisfied, nor are we finished. The original plan was crafted in a strong market. By 2005, an unbelievably strong real estate market. The four goals of the plan, as we have all heard for many years, were finding ways to create new land for affordable housing, creating incentives to house hard-to-reach populations, harnessing the private market to create affordable housing, and preserving government-assisted affordable housing. The economic dislocation created by the boom caused a dramatic loss in the existing affordable housing stock as government-assisted units went market rate. And in addition to that, we saw shiny, expensive condos popping up in neighborhoods that when I started in this business in the late 1980s in New York, I never would have imagined would have seen market rate luxury development. We never thought that neighborhoods across the city, from East New York to the South Bronx, could support that kind of development. And the reality is, as we have found out in the last year, is that many of those neighborhoods have had a hard time supporting those kinds of developments. And many of those developments are in trouble, both the projects that were assisted and that were taken out of the programs and tried to be converted to market, as well as the condo developments all over the city that are stalled and unable to sell and are sitting empty in neighborhoods. So where do we go from here? The first thing is that we remain true to the tenets of the New Housing Marketplace Plan. The programs that were created under the plan form a solid base for continued progress. We continue to create and preserve housing using the planks of that broad platform, from the inclusionary zoning initiatives to large-scale new construction efforts to our supportive housing efforts and to our work to assist to preserve HUD-assisted units. But faced with the current economic realities, we must and are examining every element of the plan, every new market-driven innovation in front of us, and looking at the way forward through a different lens with a different kind of focus. There are challenges in front of us, to be sure, but we are accustomed to challenges in our industry. At every turn, the New York City affordable housing industry has innovated, reinvented itself, and figured out how to succeed and deliver services that are needed to New York City residents. Why am I so sure we'll succeed this time? Because of our collective history. Faced with abandoned neighborhoods and unprecedented population decline in the 1970s, this city created a set of tools that literally rebuilt our city. Faced with the economic crisis looming after the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and increased demand for affordable housing, the New Housing Marketplace Plan was created. And in 2005, faced with the hottest real estate market in recent memory, we doubled down on that plan. We made it twice as big and twice as ambitious and set forth with the largest municipal housing plan in the nation's history. In short, our collective history is based on facing the most daunting challenges and innovating new solutions. I encourage all of us to take a look backwards at what HPD commissioners Paul Crotty, Abe Biederman, Felice Machete put into motion. Times were tougher then. The fiscal health of the city was more dire, the population was falling, neighborhoods were literally burning. But faced with those facts, these leaders did not blink. They developed new programs and policies that shaped our city. So what will we do in the face of today's economic crisis and its effects on people, neighborhoods, and the real estate market? We'll create new innovative solutions and new programs that address today's unique challenges. The promise of today's crisis is the realization of a bigger dream that I think we all share, a more affordable, sustainable, and viable New York City. The promise for the future is possible because of the current crisis. We have opportunities now that didn't exist when we created the New Housing Marketplace Plan, and we are retooling that plan around four key values. First, the way forward begins with a recognition that New York City, as much as any other city in the country or in the world, is a city of neighborhoods, and that without our continued investment in affordable housing, our neighborhoods will not thrive. To this end, the entire team at HPD is committed to considering micro issues in this macro city. We will apply a local lens to everything we do, focusing block by block, home by home where necessary, to connect our work with cities' investments in education, transportation, public housing, and health. In doing this, we are putting New York forward as the model for what choice neighborhoods means. The second piece of our strategy is a recognition that any good neighborhood strategy begins with an unwavering commitment to expanding the supply of affordable housing through targeted new construction and preservation programs. In this market, in the face of this crisis, this expansion of the affordable housing stock will come in new forms. New forms like an expanded effort to preserve existing government-assisted housing stock in a market today where the incentive to buy out, to opt out of those programs, to achieve the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow is substantially weakened. We will reclaim units that were taken out of the affordable housing stock during the heat of the real estate market and that are now carrying unsustainable debt. We'll reposition failed luxury developments into affordable housing. And we will target new construction to create sustainable neighborhoods and leverage our investments in education, transportation, and healthy neighborhoods. The third tenet as we move forward is that we cannot talk about investing in neighborhoods and expanding the supply of affordable housing without focusing attention and resources on ensuring that the housing stock we have is sustainable and high quality. So far, frankly, we have been lucky. The financial strain in today's market has not yet led to widespread decline in housing quality, but there's reason to worry. We've seen this movie before, and we know in this city that too often financial distress leads to physical distress. To head off disaster, we will marry our proactive code enforcement efforts with our efforts to employ sustainable and energy-efficient retrofitting techniques to preserve more of the existing stock and ensure that we can increase the quality of the existing housing stock in neighborhoods across this city. Finally, we share with all of you an underlying commitment to stabilizing families, recognizing that now more than ever, in the face of today's economic crisis, families and individuals are facing hardship more than any other group or institution or organization. We cannot and will not let these families go unsupported, and we'll explore every option to support the families that are affected by the economic dislocation that we face today. We will expand our efforts to prevent the scourge of foreclosures, and working with our sister agencies around the city, we will seek new ways to expand housing options for families facing homelessness in the face of today's crisis. In doing all of these things and more, we will not only create and preserve enough housing for 500,000 people, but we will make New York City's neighborhoods more affordable and more sustainable for the long term. Clearly, we have a lot of work to do. There's probably 7 million details that go into each one of those 4 points. But having fielded the largest municipal housing program in the country, not once, but twice, having in effect shown the rest of the nation how to do it right, we are not about to squander the opportunities that we have before us. In all, the City of New York, with its partners in the vibrant and unyieldingly passionate affordable housing and supportive housing industry in this city, is on course to reaching the mayor's goal of preserving or building 165,000 units. And as I have said, we will do this by confronting the challenges that we face, capitalizing on the opportunities presented by the current market. We really do have unprecedented power and resources to exploit this market and make it work for all of us and for the neighborhoods and families of the city for today, but also for the future. Our legacy will be making New York City a more affordable, sustainable, and viable city for current residents and for those who will call New York home in the future. I really do believe that the best is yet to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. So I'm going to introduce Manny Fernandez. After he does a little bit of Q&A himself, he's going to ask you to put up your hands. We have a couple of people who are going to come around with microphones. We're only going to have time for just a few. We're going to have time for only a few questions. So that's the way it's going to work. Manny Fernandez is a reporter at the New York Times covering the housing beat, among other things. He's been there now since 2005. and previously was a reporter at the Washington Post and the San Francisco Chronicle. Manny?
Thank you. Commissioner, always a pleasure.
It's good to see you.
All right. I'm just going to dive in with some questions.
Please.
I know that our time is limited here, and I know a lot of people have some questions themselves. Just to jump on some of the points that you just hit on, one of the things I was wondering is that the timeline for the mayor's plan, was 2013, then that was pushed back fairly recently to 2014, and I think some people are wondering, will there be another one-year extension? Do you guys need another one-year extension to meet that goal because of the economy? Is there going to be another extension?
As of right now, given where we sit with the capital budget today and with our other funding strategies, we're not going to need another year. On the other hand, I think as the mayor himself has said on many occasions, we don't quite yet know how long this recession is going to drag on. We don't quite yet know how bad the budget situation is going to be. So I think the important point is that we are committed to making it happen. And I think the most important piece that I would point out that I think shows the innovation and the commitment to that is the Housing Development Corporation, our sister agency, of which I am also the chairman, in the original plan was committed to providing $550 million worth of its corporate reserves in the form of subsidy to sort of match the capital budget dollars that HPD was putting in. And instead, to date, the Housing Development Corporation has put up $850 million worth of corporate reserves to fund the projects that we're doing in the new housing marketplace plan. And I think we're looking at strategies from continuing HDC's investment to looking at new sources that we can pull in to ensure that we can meet the goal of 2014, really regardless of what happens in the economy going forward. But I think we're all cautiously optimistic that at this point we feel confident that we have a way forward that will allow us to achieve that goal.
Thank you. On the same point, are you concerned, about government focusing so much energy and resources on responding to this crisis, saving some deals in the short term, but losing a focus, losing a long-term view of creating and not just preserving affordable housing in New York City? Do you worry about that? Is there a long-term view that is sort of at risk by focusing so much attention on the current crisis?
I think it's a great question. I think absolutely it's something that I think about every single day, and I think that what I believe, based on the incredible work of the teams at HPD and HDC, is that by focusing on the opportunities that exist in today's market, we're not going to lose sight of that larger vision. But in fact, because of that, we have an opportunity, perhaps a better opportunity today than we did when the plan was first created, to achieve the ultimate goal of the 165,000 units. The 165,000 units is the number, but the ultimate goal of the new housing marketplace plan is to create a more affordable New York. And with the conditions that we're seeing now, with rents beginning to come down, with the incentives to take properties to and convert them to market rate, we have an opportunity, and I believe, frankly, an obligation to put New York City's resources to work to ensure that our existing housing stock stays affordable for the long term. And doing that in conjunction with a commitment to continuing to create new units, we should be ahead of the game when we come out of this and have a better chance of sort of really achieving that ultimate goal of a more affordable New York.
Okay. And one last question, then I'll open it up to questions from the audience. You had mentioned, the problem of financial distress leading to physical distress.
Yep.
Earlier this month, the Citizens Housing and Planning Council released a report on over-leveraged buildings, essentially over-leveraged meaning that the debt on these buildings is unsupportable by the income generated by the rents. This report said that 100,000 rental units in the city are in over-leveraged buildings and are threatened with foreclosure. I just was wondering, do you guys believe that the number is that high, and how big of a worry is this for you guys?
So I think it's as good a number as anybody has. To be honest, do I know for sure that it's that high? I don't. What I would say is that we are absolutely very focused on this issue. I think that the reality is that the financial distress that the multifamily industry in New York faced in the 1970s is in large part what led to the dramatic disinvestment in neighborhoods. And we want to be sure that that kind of situation doesn't begin to evolve again. And I think that the fundamentals of our economy and of our market are in some ways stronger than they were back then. Our population is not declining, it's continuing to grow. And while we're seeing job losses, we're also seeing opportunities to diversify the economic base of the city and bring new businesses in. So, I think that on the fundamental side, I think we're in a better shape than we were in the 70s. At the same time, I think there is a real risk in many of the neighborhoods that we have all spent the better part of the last 25 years rebuilding, that this phenomenon of over-leveraging and the financial distress faced by the multifamily portfolio can have on a neighborhood-by-neighborhood basis a severe impact on the quality of life, not just in those buildings and for those residents of those buildings, but for the neighborhoods at large. What I also would say is that I think when you look at the problem, whether it's 100,000 units or whether it's 50,000 units or whether it's 75,000 units, I think when you look at the problem, really you have to categorize the problem into different pieces. There is a set of properties that are today, as we sit here right now, both in financial distress and facing foreclosure, but also in severe physical distress. And you, Manny, wrote very well about a specific portfolio in the Bronx that we're very focused on. But there are other portfolios like this around the city. And so, you have to sort of focus on that set of properties first. There's another set of properties that I think would sort of create the second tier of properties that we would be looking at. And those are properties that were formerly assisted affordable housing properties, Mitchell-Lamas, HUD-assisted properties that were taken out of the programs during the boom years, purchased at prices that could only be supported by plans that would have taken rents to market, and then oftentimes refinanced again with higher debt levels than existed before. And it's those set of properties that, while incredibly complicated to figure out how to intervene, are properties that I think we see an opportunity to reclaim those properties into the affordable housing stock, preserve them for the existing residents, and preserve them as affordable housing for the long-term viability of our city. There's a third set of properties that I would say make up that 100,000 that frankly are going to work themselves out, that don't need government intervention, that aren't going to face physical distress, that the financiers, the investors in those properties are going to take their lumps. They're going to feel the pain of the bad investment that they made, but that ultimately will not lead to any physical distress or deterioration of the buildings or any displacement for the residents. And our job on those properties, I believe, is to create a mechanism where we can track those properties, we can be sure through proactive code enforcement that if there are signs of deterioration in those buildings, we're proactively addressing it and going after it, and ensuring that there's no dislocation or housing quality deterioration, but that ultimately the end result will be a restructuring of the financial situation of buildings that will not have any long-term effect on the affordable housing stock or the residents that live in those buildings.
Thank you. Want to open up some questions now?
People raise your hand, and then you guys do one more while we go around.
Okay. On that same point, I guess maybe, 5 years ago, you would have thought that code enforcement would be sort of, a dedicated but yet small kind of element of what you do, and yet there are a lot of buildings in, a 1970s style South Bronx condition in very small pockets. Have you guys had to beef up code enforcement? How has all this sort of changed how you guys enforce the code?
It's a great question. A couple of things I would say. One is that I think statistically speaking, which is not necessarily the best way to look at this, but statistically speaking on a citywide basis, the quality of our city's housing stock is as good as it's ever been. And that's the good news. On the other hand, as you point out, and this again gets to my point about looking at everything through a neighborhood lens, on a neighborhood-by-neighborhood basis, that statement is still largely true, but there are pockets of deterioration. One of the things that we have done in the last few years that has been an enormous success, working with the City Council and in particular Speaker Quinn, was to create the Alternative Enforcement Program, which is a proactive enforcement program, and frankly the first one that HPD has ever implemented. Our code enforcement system in New York is largely complaint-driven and always has been. But we created the Alternative Enforcement Program to create a more proactive approach so that we can identify troubled buildings and specifically target them with enforcement activities. We're also looking at ways, working again with Speaker Quinn and the entire council, looking at ways in which we can improve the legislative sticks, if you will, that we have in place so that code enforcement and building codes and violations and emergency repair liens become a stronger enforcement tool for us as we look to sort of ensure the housing quality in our neighborhoods.
Okay. Anyone first? Okay.
Good morning, Commissioner.
Good morning.
We have observed that a lot of our clients who qualify for housing subsidies and vouchers wind up being placed in apartments that have documented HPD violations. And the housing subsidies then are paying market rate to preserve apartments that are substandard and have violations. So my question is whether HPD can play any role in enforcing the housing code and ensuring that people are not placed into these apartments, and in particular that the city is not maintaining a market for these substandard apartments.
So can I just ask quickly where you're from and what
Yes, my name's Piper Hoffman. I'm from the Partnership for the Homeless.
Great.
We run a home-based program and a number of other direct service programs, so we see a range of clients.
So, a couple of things I would say. One is one of the things that I think we need to look at HPD from the sort of efficiency of our operation and the effectiveness of our operation is that we have three different sets of enforcement and inspection teams. We've got the folks that enforce the New York City housing code. We also have folks that inspect for housing quality standard, which is a federal standard that applies to Section 8. And then we also have inspectors that inspect and enforce the renovation standards and rehab standards for buildings that we're building or investing in. So clearly we know that there are instances like the ones that you're talking about, and are working hard to ensure that when we do a housing quality inspection, right, an HQS inspection that makes an apartment eligible for Section 8, that we are also examining and understanding when there are housing maintenance code violations, which may not necessarily, believe it or not, mean that they don't meet housing quality standards, that we're doing both of those things at the same time. So it's a concern. It's a problem that we're aware of and that we're trying to address by ensuring that our inspectors are cross-trained and can inspect for both things when they go into inspect an apartment. And then the other part of it is that there are other agencies DHS has their own inspectors. NYCHA has their own inspectors, and so we need to work to ensure that those inspectors also know when there may very well be housing code violations in an apartment, even if it meets HQS, and get our code enforcement inspectors out there prior to a family moving in.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I think many housing advocates believe that however admirable the new housing marketplace is, that the affordable housing that's generated through it is offset by the affordable housing that's lost through vacancy decontrol, and yet the Bloomberg administration has declined to support the repeal of vacancy decontrol. And I know that your predecessor as commissioner said that the rationale for that was that rent regulation isn't specifically targeted at low and moderate income people, and some people who are in rent-regulated apartments have relatively high incomes. But that seems to be that overlooks the fact that most people in rent-regulated housing do have really modest incomes. Mm-hmm. So that when that housing is lost through deregulation, that is a total loss for affordable housing in the city. So assuming that that's still the rationale, do you have a response to that?
So it's a great question. I would say a couple of things. One is that in today's market, there are, as there are in other times, there are many challenges faced by the million rent regulated units in this city. The units that are most at risk of the problem of over-leveraging that we were talking about before are rent-regulated units, because those units were bought under assumptions that said that significant numbers of those units could be taken out of the system through luxury and vacancy decontrol. The good news, and I will directly answer your question in a minute, but the good news is that those plans, those dreams of taking, Mitchell Lama building in the Bronx and taking it market through luxury and vacancy decontrol, those assumptions built into the financing did not pan out. That's good news for tenants that are rent regulated. It's bad news for the buildings, and it's bad news for the investors. That being said, I think we also know, number one, with the obvious caveat that rent regulation is a state program, not a city administered program. We also know that the debate around vacancy and luxury decontrol is one that will continue. And we are, looking at that debate and paying attention to that debate and trying to determine, which we have not yet, whether the sort of circumstances we face in today's market pose a different opportunity and a different approach to the question of changing the rules around vacancy decontrol and luxury decontrol. So I don't have a new position to announce for you here today, but I think, like I said in my remarks, we are literally examining every single aspect of our housing policy and the plan under the new housing marketplace plan to determine how our position and policy should change based on the circumstances we face today.
Good morning, Commissioner.
Good morning.
Hi, Manny. My name is Jessica Schachter. I'm with the Children's Aid Society. I coordinate the Subprime Neediest Cases Fund. A lot of the clients that come through our doors are clients who live in multifamily dwellings out in Jamaica or in Bed-Stuy or Far Rockaway or in the Bronx. And their incomes are just above what would make them eligible for any subsidized housing. And what we do is we do home retention and relocation assistance. But for the tenants who need to relocate, some of which have already previously been in New York City homeless shelters, a few of them we've taken out of foreclosed properties and we've helped them relocate to other multiple family dwellings because that's all they can afford.
Right.
But some of those homes are now in foreclosure. And so it's been a little bit of a struggle. We don't do the case management, so we don't go out and find the apartments, and all we can really do is look at the Department of Finance website to see if the home is in foreclosure before we approve any relocation funds. But what is going to be done for those homes and those tenants who aren't receiving subsidized housing assistance, but they're living off of very low incomes and are moving from one foreclosed property to another to another.
Yep. I wish I had an easy answer for that question. I think the foreclosure crisis, while more concentrated in New York than it is in other parts of the country, which is good news for New York, is still one of the most vexing problems that we face in today's economy at all levels, for the homeowners, for the tenants living in the buildings that are being foreclosed upon. It's a challenge that we face that I for one think that while we have done a lot in creating the Center for New York City Neighborhoods and working with our community-based partners in the neighborhoods that are most affected by this all over the city, by providing direct subsidies for more housing counselors, we can't possibly be satisfied with where we are, because there are still families that are losing their homes, and there are still families that are being evicted from buildings because of foreclosure. So a couple of things I would say on that. One is I think that we need a new focus, and are working not just with DHS, because they're seeing an increase in people showing up at the doors of homeless shelters in this city, when you look at the increase in homeless families showing up at the doors of homeless shelters, the only thing new today, as opposed to the last 5 years, is people that are dislocated because of a loss of their apartment or foreclosure, and so targeting assistance to those folks so that we can get them not into the shelter but into a new permanent situation is something that we're working on with DHS and the Center for New York City Neighborhoods to figure out what the strategies are. We have a lot of apartments out there, both apartments created under the New Housing Marketplace Plan, but also apartments that were created through other HPD programs over the course of the last 30 years. We know where they are, we know who manages them, and we ought to be able to figure out a system to be able to facilitate relocation for folks that are affected. But the front end of that, right, is that we also need to do more to try to prevent the actual foreclosure. And there are a lot of people who I think have sort of seen the way this has played out over the last couple of years and feel like we've done a lot and foreclosures are still happening, and maybe there's just nothing that we can do and this is just going to happen. But I still think we have not done enough, and so we're looking at a host of new efforts that we could spearhead at HPD, working in partnership with all of our community-based partners around the city, that would expand our efforts to support renters that are facing eviction, but would also expand our support for homeowners who may need just a little bit more direct assistance in order to be able to prevent the foreclosure and get to a place where they can modify or refinance under one of the many programs that are out there now available for modification and refinance. So it's I don't have a silver bullet for you, but it's a serious problem that we're focused on.
One more question.
Good morning, and thank you for your summary of what's going on. I've been watching over the last 30 years what HPD has been doing in the South Bronx particularly, and transforming it from the burning hulks to the little house on the prairie to a neighborhood that's filled with vibrant new construction and housing so many people who own their homes. I do walking tours in the South Bronx now for the general public with the help of HPD. I should mind you that we've got a lot of good cooperation from the people that work with you. But my question is this. Beginning with the Charlotte Street projects, those were some of the first. Those are the odd little ranch houses that people bought for $80,000, back more than 20 years ago. Last time I checked, those were selling for over $400,000. They may have gone down with the recent downturn in the economy. But I'm wondering if there's a mechanism, and there's so many more people that have bought houses that are very highly subsidized with the cost of the land, the mortgage, the construction costs. You know, how, probably I'd say half the cost of the property is really subsidized. And these people are given gifts that maybe they deserve, and they're going to keep up, and they're going to keep those neighborhoods going, and they're going to be pioneers. But when they sell those houses at a great profit often, how much of that income is generated back to HPD or to the city so that this process can roll over and continue, unlike what happened with Mitchell-Lama 50 years ago?
So again, a great question. This is the great
You're
thing about New York.
today.
You know, you have not only do you get all these people in the room, but they all know the issues so well. It's really terrific. So a couple of things. You know, one is that you know, homeownership as an affordable housing tool is a very interesting policy debate, right? Homeownership in this country is not just about, for better or worse, is not just about housing, but it's also about building wealth and being able to sort of you know, take advantage of the proverbial American dream and build a life for you and your family where you can generate some wealth off of that property. And I think over the years, homeownership programs that have been affordable homeownership programs, excuse me, have gone through many different cycles of how they're structured to address that competing set of priorities for that program, and this is true not just in New York, but in other parts of the country. So there have been programs where you know, the city, whether it be HPD or some other city in the country, has put a lien on the property for the amount of the subsidy put in, but that lien evaporates over 2 or 3 years, and then the homeowner can sell and take the proceeds of that sale and for themselves. There have also been programs that have changed to policies where there's an extended period where the lien exists and it doesn't evaporate over a short term, and there's an expected sharing of equity between the city agency and the city government that provides the subsidy and the homeowner. And you know, frankly, you point to Mitchell-Lama's, you point to the homes on Charlotte Street, all of the various different homeownership programs that HPD has run over the last 30 years, frankly, have treated this issue somewhat differently. I think one of the things that over the last 4 or 5 or 6 years we've tried to do is, one, sort of create one standard for how we address this competing goal of homeownership, and have looked at longer-term liens, but also taking the value of the land into the lien. A lot of times the lien amount was just the actual cash that went in. And so we have put not just liens for the cash on the properties, but put enforcement mortgages on properties as well that allow us to have more ability to capture some of the value when a property is sold. But we've also looked at opportunities to create more long-term affordable housing strategies. The City Council recently passed a significant change to the inclusionary zoning program. As you may know, the inclusionary zoning program, which started in 1987 here in New York, has only been a rental program. You could only do, up until the recent change, only do rental housing, because the requirement of that housing was that it be permanently affordable. The benefit that we're providing to developers of additional density is a permanent benefit, so the housing must remain affordable in perpetuity. The challenge with homeownership is how do you make that happen? And the City Council recently passed a very progressive change to the inclusionary zoning program that we supported that would create a permanent affordable homeownership option through the inclusionary zoning program, where there would be sort of regulated increases in the value based on cost of living increases, so that people could still gain some appreciation and return on their investment in purchasing the home, but ultimately over time the home would not become unaffordable. So there's a number of things that we're trying to do. There's a number of ways in which we're looking at it. I hope and pray that within a couple of years we'll be able to do more home ownership, because right now there's not a lot of home ownership development happening in the city, and we'll be able to really tackle some of these things.
Thank you, Commissioner. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the time.
All right, so, well, thank you. Glad you could make it. Why don't the rest of the panelists come on up? And, you know, that last point is a great point to switch into this, because I think a couple of people on the panel have given a lot of thought to that question of limited equity versus full equity in properties. And the whole question of transfer of wealth over the years. You know, what happens, transferring wealth can actually be a way to bring a family out of poverty permanently, but it also seems very unfair on the individual level. So let me introduce our panelists. Martin Dunn is president of Dunn Development Corporation, which he's been doing now for several years. He previously ran Flatbush Development Corporation and East New York Urban Youth Corps. Next to him is Mark Willis, who's a visiting scholar at the Ford Foundation, was in City Hall for a time many years ago, and at HPD as well, and then at Chase Community Development and J.P. Morgan Chase, where he worked for 19 years. Amazing. And Ismini Spiliotis is director of New York Acorn Housing Company, where she's been now for nearly a decade and a half. Prior to that, she was a co-founder of WEDCO, Women's Housing and Economic Development Corporation in the Bronx, and helped build Urban Horizons at Morrisania Hospital in the Bronx. So, Manny, come on up. It's still yours.
All right. Thank you, everyone. You know, I think the commissioner kind of set his own view of the landscape and what HPD is trying to do. But I guess I kind of thought we should get, you know, sort of an insider's view of the theme of the panel. And I was just going to ask Martin if you could describe for us, you know, how has the economy changed the affordable housing landscape, and, you know, how bad is the situation, or is it not as bad as people think? And just what has the economy sort of done for what you do every day?
Sure. There's certainly been, you know, major dislocations in the affordable housing financial markets. You know, starting from the tax credit programs, where tax credit raises, the amount of money we can get per dollar of tax credits has dropped in New York 20 to 30%, and that's compared to it drying up in most parts of the country, so that's had a big impact. Credit from banks has certainly tightened. It's still available. We don't have a problem getting credit for bank loans, for construction and permanent loans on rental housing. It's pretty much dried up on home ownership housing. I think on the flip side, there's still a huge amount of government investment from the city, state, and federal government. So we have 350 units in construction. We have 800 units in pre-development, and so there's still a lot of housing happening. And we do hope to see some silver linings in dropping land prices and dropping construction prices, which we're not seeing significantly yet, but the market's still, you know, in the correction mode, so we hope to see more benefits there. But, you know, again, if you look around the rest of the country where, and even outside of New York City and the rest of New York State, where people can't sell tax credits at any price, can't get financing, even for the strongest developers, New York City is still in a very strong position to continue to create and preserve affordable housing.
And I guess I would ask the panel, I mean, has the Bloomberg administration done enough? Is it doing enough? Is the mayor's plan, you know, right for the time, or is there other things that could be done? I'm just wondering if the panel could offer maybe its own sort of report card on how the administration has done thus far.
Well, I'll take a shot at it. I think Rafael laid out exactly the right framework for this, which is there is the long-term shortage of affordability. That hasn't really gone away. I think the pressure's come off. There are some properties that are now more affordable. Students can live in Manhattan again. That's all good, but if you look at the percent of people who are paying more than 50% of their income for rental, or even more than 50% of their income for home ownership, those are significant percentages. They really haven't, as far as we know, fallen much. And we have every expectation that the city's economy is going to recover here. In fact, we've lost a lot fewer jobs so far than we had expected that we would. Tax revenues are down a lot, partly because of so much dependence on Wall Street. But in terms of the underlying economy, we have every reason to expect, as the 2030 plan had, the population continue to rise. It has continued here. So I think you need to pay a lot of attention to how do we continue to increase the supply of affordable housing. And as your question, Manny, pointed out, you got to worry about whether so much focus on the short-term issues here, you're going to burn up money that we really need to use to increase the supply of housing. And as Martin said, it's probably not going to be possible to do that on the home ownership side, so we really need to focus on the rental housing. And continue to produce that while we deal with some very specific and significant neighborhood impacts that Rafael talked about.
Mm-hmm. I'll add a little bit. I mean, I think it's hard to, and it's not, he's not here, so I can speak my mind, but it's hard to be critical of what the Bloomberg administration has done. It's unprecedented, the investment in where you'd expect to see huge cutbacks in a tough economy. They're really sticking by their plan. So I think you have to give a lot of credit. I think there's also been very thoughtful leadership on housing issues, and they're being very strategic with the resources they have, which I think is very important. I think the one thing that didn't come up in the commissioner's remarks or in the questions yet is the role of affordable housing development as a job creation and economic development tool. And I think one of the concerns that has to be kept in mind as we switch to looking at things like converting failed market rate condos to affordable housing or switching to a preservation strategy is that the construction side of what we do created a huge amount of jobs and was a real economic engine for the city. And with the decline in construction activities, that's having a very debilitating effect. And so in addition, the city needs more housing units. We need more affordable housing units for sure, but we need more housing units across the board. And so I think you really have to balance, you have to keep a focus on housing issues and the use of money. Converting condominiums in a market rate neighborhood to affordable housing, I personally think is a poor use of money because that housing would readjust in the market and would be more affordable than it was as luxury housing and brings a new unit on. And I think in that case, the government subsidies would be better spent creating a new unit and creating new jobs and economic activity with that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Manny?
Thanks, Manny.
Yeah.
I guess I think that downturns are often an opportunity, and I'm really appreciative that the city and HPD in particular have taken it the downturn in the economy has taken it as an opportunity to look at what programs they have, how they're spending their money, and taken. It's almost like you have a chance because you've been in such a new construction mode for so long that. You're running so fast sometimes you don't have a chance to really stop and think about, some of the implications, et cetera. But we heard some things today, and what we see in the work that we do at Acorn Housing, people paying huge amounts of their income in rent. We just finished, we just spent a year and a half leasing almost 500 apartments. And we've rejected almost all of our applicants, many of them because their income could not be verified because they had worked, they had stopped working, they didn't qualify based on income. And so these are just regular folks, just working 2 or 3 jobs trying to get by. And there isn't a plan for them. There really actually isn't a plan for them. They are overpaying their rent now, and we could not house them. And so So that's just it's a real predicament. And I would challenge us to, this idea of increasing supply, which we've been, kind of under the new marketplace, we've been really kind of all part of. We've all benefited from it. Neighborhoods have benefited from it. But I think we could stop and ask ourselves what a definition of increase in supply is. We heard today that for, every unit that's built, X number of units are lost. And I think that would not, so then when you look at, the net, that it may not be a net increase in supply. And so I think that we really need to really look at preservation, look at new ways to take advantage of the city. What Rafael said is this neighborhood strategy to create economies of scale as we target communities, and really look at ways to not lose units out of rent stabilization, preserve them, code enforcement. These are real critical factors instead of just building, building, building.
I mean, I think with such a focus on preservation over creation, doesn't that sort of change, just sort of the definition of affordable housing in New York City? I mean, doesn't it? Like you said, it's easier to preserve than create, but is the city sort of losing something by not creating more, by focusing more on creation? Should there be more of a focus on creation, I guess, is the...
I'll give an economist answer, which is you want to keep increasing the supply. And we've had a lot of, as Martin said, a lot of private construction going on, I think up to 30,000 units a year, which was the highest we've seen since the early 1960s. And I want to come back to the job creation part of that. But that helps, because that takes pressure. I mean, part of the reason rents at the lower end are going up is because people at higher incomes or middle incomes are competing for those rents along with the people who are very low income. And so it does help. It's hard to point specifically to who it does help, but it helps to increase the overall supply, and we need to keep doing that. And just to add a piece to Martin's, one of the big advantages with housing, particularly when there's some private financing involved, is it is one of the best economic development programs you can have, because in some programs it's actually been shown to pay for itself. The amount of money the city needs to put in, or the government needs to put in, it gets leveraged up, and the taxes that come back as a result of that, in the end, give more money to government than they put in. That sounds a little strange, but it is by the very nature of the leveraging in the housing business. So it is a great economic recovery program as well. So I don't think, I certainly agree that you can't just build new housing, but I also think you have to be very careful on when we use the term preservation as to what we do with it. And if we're going to try and deal with properties that have been over-leveraged and can't support, the rents don't support the current debt service, I don't think that's a preservation the city ought to be involved in. I think that's an open pit of money.
Yeah, I mean, I think the concern is, so when you look at the over-leveraged portfolio, and I should disclose I'm on the board of CHPC and was part of the group that looked at that report, they, you have over-leveraged buildings that assumed, units, rents going up significantly based on, taking them out of rent stabilization, which, as the commissioner said, is largely not panned out. So the fear of loss of affordable units to vacancy and luxury decontrol and a lot of those portfolios turned out to be unfounded, and the investors are in big trouble. However, even as the notes on those buildings are being sold, they're still being sold at values that can't be supported by the current rents. The market is not fully corrected. So I think I think, first of all, reforming rent stabilization to get rid of the decontrols, I personally support and would think would have some of the biggest impact to get owners and investors, just take it off the table that you're going to be able to significantly change rents. The market, and then code enforcement is the other big thing. I think the worry on those over-leveraged properties is the housing conditions and the potentially, the effect on both tenants and the potential effect on neighborhoods. But intervening with subsidy, we're not there yet. I mean, a lot of these properties will have to go into foreclosure, Again, the market of buying the notes on these and trying to restructure them has not corrected yet. So if a building right now, if the rent roll can support $20 million of debt and someone had 70, why is someone now buying the note for 40 million if the rent can only support 20 million? And does it make sense for government to come in and bridge that 20 million to make it affordable? I don't think quite yet. I think the market has a little more ways to go. And I think if strong code enforcement can make it clear to buyers that you're not going to be able to disinvest in the building to make that debt work, I think that has to be the approach. If you get those regulatory code enforcement and stopping rent stabilization abuses underhand, the price of that debt's going to come way down, and then I think there's a more appropriate role for subsidy to come in. And I do think HPD is being very thoughtful about this. I think they're not looking at this across the board. They're saying, in what neighborhoods is this going to have a neighborhood impact? Just as with new construction now, if we come into the city with a site, it used to be we came in, and if the numbers work, we just get in line. Now they're looking at the site and saying, we don't think that's a place where we're going to do new construction because the neighborhood's strong enough and the market will deal with that eventually. And we want the new construction to be in a location where it may help offset the foreclosure crisis or may help prop up a neighborhood. And I got to tell you, that thoughtfulness, Rafael's the 7th commissioner I've worked with. We haven't seen that.
Mm-hmm. I don't think we're talking about preservation just like, just like throwing money away, okay? I mean, I think that the problems you heard, which were the, units being lost to rent stabilization, the over-leveraging, people overpaying their rent, you need to create a regulatory, as Martin said, I mean, you really need to create a world out there where people understand, the private sector, private developers, private investors, understand that the rules have changed and they're not going to be played that way anymore. And the pawns in this game are not going to be the tenants, and the people or the agencies funding it are not going to be the city. Okay, and I agree, we are not there yet, and it is. The HEART program really worries me because for me it feels, I understand the desperation. I work in Brooklyn, I live in Brooklyn, I'm surrounded by very high vacant buildings, but the fact of the matter is that until everyone's, kind of hurting badly enough, so to speak, right? The bank, the investor, the number that the city may show up with, I think will end up being on the high side. So I think preservation, some of the techniques of preservation don't cost that much at all. Actually maintaining code enforcement, making sure that the people aren't becoming homeless or entering a shelter system or applying to every lottery that's out there because they can't live there, not just because the rents are high, but because the conditions of those buildings are deplorable. You read every application, and they're checking off why we're asked, and they check off every reason why they're looking for an apartment, okay? And it's high rents and it's deplorable conditions, high rents and deplorable conditions over and over and over again. So you need to create you really need to put the word out there. And unfortunately, the word is not just kind of, around coffee tables or whatever. I mean, it has to be a policy, has to be regulatory, may need to be legislated, so that people really, because people left to their own devices, unfortunately, we don't always see the outcomes for the most needy in the direction we need them to be.
Mm-hmm. Mark, earlier you had mentioned, talking a little bit about job creation. There's some bills in Albany right now to require affordable housing developers to pay the construction workers the prevailing wage. And I just was wondering, if you could talk a little bit about that. What, I guess you would think that labor unions and, nonprofit affordable housing developers would be on the same sides of a lot of issues. And this one seems like they're not. And I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that debate as far as, job creation.
Right. This is probably one of the most difficult issues. I think rent regulation is one, but the issue of prevailing wage, and that is there's a state law that requires, if government money is being used, that for construction, then the construction workers are paid what is called the prevailing wage. So that is what, in general, is thought of as being union wages. And so this gets a very complicated conversation, first of all, because union wages then go along with union work rules, et cetera, and there are estimates it costs 30, 40% more to build a building under union labor than with non-union labor. And as is obvious from Rafael's conversation, there's only limited resources for affordable housing. So if in order to pay for the extra cost of building here, you'd be able to build, renovate, preserve a lot fewer units with the same amount of money. On the other side, there is the view, very sensible, that the best affordable housing program is a good job. And so you get involved in here, well, what is a reasonable amount of, what's the right amount of pay that people should get? And you can see that those who are interested in helping people in the housing industry are torn, in many cases, within their own organizations on both sides of those issues. And this is an annual, I'll say dance, fight, whatever, in Albany, as to whether the prevailing wage law should be extended to the city's loan programs. Because right now, if the city builds it directly, then it is subject to, I believe, to the prevailing wage. If it has federal money, and the recovery money from the federal government has come with Davis-Bacon, which is somewhat similar, but raises the same set of issues about higher costs. Now the question is, many of the city's programs are loan programs, and if the money is being lent by the city, historically it has not, you have not been subject to prevailing wage for construction programs done that are assisted by city loans. So there's no simple answer, as Rafael pointed out in other cases. These are just tough issues. If there were a simple answer, we probably would have come to that a long time ago. But there is now, you can count on it every year, sort of an annual fight in Albany on this.
Martin, can you talk a little bit about, if you were required to pay a prevailing wage, what would that mean to the projects in your pipeline? What would that mean to you and the bottom line?
Sure. First of all, there's another very important issue in this debate, which is why I think you see a lot of the nonprofit housing groups being against the prevailing wage provisions, which is that who gets the jobs. When we work in neighborhoods, when there's government money in or there's local land use provisions, the local council person, the state elected officials, the community board wants to see local jobs. And the unions generally do not reflect or have significant representation. There's a few unions that are exceptions in the neighborhoods that we work. And so often it's the trade-off of union jobs versus local jobs. And again, every time we do a project in a neighborhood, we're pushed to be hiring locally and have the workforce look like the neighborhood. And that is generally, for the most part, not possible at all with union labor. So my company and other companies at times have talked to some of the unions about doing, preferential wages and stuff with for affordable housing. But as the unions can tell you how many members they have by zip codes, and a lot of the unions just don't have members in the neighborhoods. And so the backlash we would get locally would be tremendous. So keeping the other economic issues aside. But if if the prevailing wage, if the union wages are 40% higher, that's a portion of the overall construction cost. So I think people agree 20–25% is the amount it would increase. It just means you're going to get a lot less affordable housing, which has been an issue with the federal TCAP money. So if you had a $1 million gap on $10 million of construction costs, you need $3.5 million to fill that gap if it's with prevailing wage. So obviously, you're going to get a lot less affordable housing. You're going to have less jobs in the communities that you're working in. And therefore, less jobs in the community you're working in, less support from the local elected officials for putting money into these programs.
Would you have to cut back on some of your projects? Would you have to delay some?
Yeah, you'd have to cut back, you'd cut in half probably the amount of units you could do. And we'd also have to switch to totally different contractors and subcontractors.
Probably everybody in the room understands the economics here, but just do it very quickly, which is that you want to serve a certain income level, you're aiming for a certain amount, a certain rent level. That rent level can cover a certain amount of debt. right? If you add, and the cost of this project goes from 10 million to 13 million, and you want to aim for the same rent, you've got to pick up that whole 3 million more with pure subsidy.
All government money.
Right, so it's not like this is shared or anything. This comes directly out of the overall budget that the city has to do affordable housing. So it's pretty dramatic, actually, in terms of its economic impact.
Right. So if we're doubling the subsidy we need on a project, they can do half as many units.
Okay. Is Manny, did you?
I mean, I think, you know, again, bringing my Acorn relationship hat, it's hard. It's very, very hard. I think that the issue around who has the jobs is really critical. And we work very, very closely. A lot of the jobs Acorn Housing builds, despite, as Mark said, where we're divided in the organization, are most often non-union jobs, the construction work that we do. The sister organization is a very close friend of the union supported shop. We've tried to use that relationship to get the unions to come in with their B-rate, really negotiate better work rules so that that 20 to 25% number comes down. We've talked to them about hiring locally and the apprenticeship programs. We're not done. I think that in order for this to really come together and take the best of each of those pieces, the best that the unions have to offer and the best of the other program, of the other initiatives, it's going to take, everyone's going to, again, as this idea of everyone compromising to get somewhere, and we have not seen, and with what we've tried to push and get people to the table, we haven't been able to bridge that yet.
Okay. Another topic I want to hit on, Rafael mentioned, the approach of taking half-finished or half-empty condo buildings or luxury condo buildings and turning them into affordable housing. This seems like it's harder to do than it appears. I have some of these programs. There's some city and state programs. Just was wondering what your guys' thoughts are on those programs and if they're taking the right approach.
For me, the question, at least of the economics, is how can you use the city's money best to get affordable housing? So if you could go out there and take that condo and have it sold or rented at an affordable price that you find acceptable, that meets what the city's trying to do, and its cost to the city is comparable to what it would be if the city went and built that directly from the beginning, that's probably a rational use of the city's money. I think Martin has another dimension to talk about that, but at least you wouldn't be wasting money. I don't think there's a deal to be made at that, because these properties are hugely expensive. They were built for a luxury end. It would require a huge hit to the developers. This is not something to negotiate. You just go out and say, this is how much money we're willing to put in to get this level of rents or this sale price. See if there's anything out there. I doubt there is, quite honestly. It would take, there hasn't been Martin said very delicately, it hasn't been a full adjustment of the market yet. Maybe when there is, people will be more realistic, but I don't know.
The city has a request for proposals out right now for this initiative, and so I think we'll see how much. I think if there's strong competition among banks to unload their failed projects, then you might see good pricing. So I think the question is going to be how many people apply and what level of competition there was. But what Mark said is if the amount you're paying for that unit is the same as it would have taken to create a new unit, it's I don't think even at that level it's still rational, because that unit's already there. It's already going to house someone. The construction's already done. If you could spend the same money to create another unit, you're getting, again, an additional unit, and you're creating jobs. And I think that until the market takes a while to correct, there's buildings all over Brooklyn. Some of them are finished, where owners are going to hold out a year, 2 years if they can, to see if the market adjusts. They're going to stall bankruptcy actions, stall foreclosure actions as long as they can, and we have not seen what the real bottom of the market is. So, again, if there's a lot of competition in this RFP, maybe the city will get good values. I think people's fear is the city's going to overpay, and this is going to end up being a developer bank bailout as opposed to an affordable housing program. So I think time will tell. And again, if it was strategically targeted, that may make sense. There's in Kensington, Brooklyn, there's a project that I think for about 15, 18 months is 40% into construction. It's been stalled. It's a big eyesore. Maybe that's the kind of thing where there's a lot of construction left. You could convert that to affordable housing and deal with something that's destabilizing the neighborhood and create jobs. But in that particular case, the mezzanine lender, the bank started foreclosure. The mezzanine lender filed for bankruptcy. It's being litigated in court. It's going to take another year or 2 years. It's Chorus Bank is the lender. They're likely to go out of business before that's done. And so the buildings that I think might be most appropriate for this type of initiative aren't eligible because the fee owner and the bank have to come in together with an agreed on process. So, but I think time will tell. And as I've communicated this to HPD, and as they've said, if you never willing to risk that things may not all be perfect, we're never going to do anything. And so I think it's okay to try it and see how it goes and then evaluate it.
Right. I think coming into this also is to think about this permanent affordability, because you don't want the city to put money in and then to see it go up market quickly. So I think that's an additional piece of what is potentially better here if you can figure out how to do something along that dimension with this property.
Ms. Manny?
And I just, in one thing, and we haven't touched on it that much, it's a kind of the definition of affordability. So again, one thing that's kind of difficult to look at in this, but also just in general when we're looking at new construction versus whatever and limited resources. So here, the 165% of median for the ownership unit and 130% for the rental. Those are high. I mean, it may not be high for the number of units in downtown Brooklyn that are standing there that, might someday apply, and maybe they fit more, they would be, but they're top of the market. That subsidy offer by HPD at 130% is really, they spent years kind of retooling their programs to try to kind of match up the amount of subsidy that directly relates to affordability. And it's not a huge number, the 50, the 75,000, but again, could it be better spent somewhere else? And what are you buying? And for whom? And so for me, it's troublesome. The 130 on the rental and the 165 is a troublesome use of the limited resource.
And I think, do we want to have some people, people who have questions, if you can raise your hands, and then people will come around and take that info, and I'm going to ask a couple more questions while they do that. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and someone will come by. I mean, one of the big players here, in addition to government, are the banks, and what are the best ways in today's economy of getting banks to finance affordable housing? Are there new either approaches, or is there just a new way of pitching something to get some financing? I don't know, Mark, you want to start and take a shot at that? What are the banks thinking right now? What's the best way to approach them?
Well, I think I think actually Martin's the right person to talk to because he says he's been doing fine. So I think whatever that magic sauce is, because it's not really an issue of affordable housing. In fact, the track record of affordable housing is much better over the business cycles than has been luxury housing or market rate housing in terms of the risk. As I think Martin pointed out here, and he and I were talking before, there still is a market at affordable rents. There's still, one of the things that banks look at is what's the, if we get the thing built on time and on budget, will the economics work? And I think affordable housing still can be demonstrated that that is the case. On the other hand, we went through, we're now the year anniversary of what I think will always be called the financial panic. Banks basically stopped lending. They stopped lending to each other, let alone to others. And the overall real estate market has been a major part, and that is actually probably going to be not just in the single-family or home ownership side, but now in the commercial real estate side. So banks are very, very reluctant to lend new money in real estate now because they got burned. And I think, unfortunately, that sometimes they forget what worked and what didn't here, and so their overall tightening of underwriting standards hurts affordable housing as much as others. You know, home ownership, as Martin said, for sale housing, that market, everybody's so uncertain about what the prices are. That's probably not going to be come back as an area where banks are going to lend for a while. But I think the rental side, there's a case to be made. But you're making it against or in an environment where banks are very, very nervous about real estate.
Mm-hmm. Martin, what are some of the secrets of your success here?
Well, first of all, I mean, it's that financing's still available. It's more expensive, and there's definitely been a weeding out of who has access to credit. You know, during the boom, both on the market rate side and even a little bit on the affordable side, everyone became a developer, right? And we were getting calls from doctors in Long Island saying, I want to get into this affordable housing, what do I do? But everyone became a developer. Lawyers, general contractors, everyone was just jumping in. Well, they're not getting financing anymore. There's definitely been a weeding out. You have to have stronger balance sheets and a better track record and more liquidity. But that being said, you know, if you meet those standards, you can get financing, and we're still seeing lenders compete. I think strengthening CRA is obviously important. The reason Ron Mullis is not here today is he's down in Washington meeting with a group of Congress people about CRA issues. We have had banks come to us in the last month saying they have a CRA review window that ends in March, and if we have deals that are ready to go by then, they're willing to be very aggressive. After March, they're not necessarily looking to talk to us. And I think there's certain things that you know, besides the home ownership, there's other things that banks have stopped doing. We started to use a lot of complex financial tools. You know, we used you know, swaps on tax-exempt bond deals and interest rate caps and other things with long-term letters of credits that are gone, that stopped several years ago. But we just saw in the last couple of days, the New York State Housing Finance Agency came out with a new product of credit enhancement for tax-exempt bonds, which will fill a gap. And that's the kind of thing we're seeing in this environment, that government's being innovative. And I know this gets technical, but the State of New York Mortgage Agency, Fannie Mae, has provided credit enhancement on bonds and other types of loans once the project is completed and you've converted to your permanent financing. They've always stayed out of construction period financing. And construction period letters of credit, where in the past we were paying 75 basis points or 0.75%. It's now jumped up on market rate deals to as much as 300 or 400 basis points, or 3 or 4%. And this is not your cost of your debt. This is just the credit enhancement. This is like effectively a type of insurance or credit enhancement. So now Fannie Mae and the Housing Finance Agency has come out and said they'll provide inexpensive credit enhancement during the construction period on preservation deals, on affordable preservation deals. That's filling a big need in the market. It'll put pressure on the banks to now bring down their pricing if they want any role in that, and it's government being innovative. So financing, except on the home ownership side, is not the obstacle right now. It's a host of other things.
Mm-hmm. Is it Manny?
I want to just, I mean, Mark and Martin said it, but the issue that the banks have not looked at what's worked and what hasn't, okay? We, the nonprofit community and many others and the city, you know, tried to say what was getting built in terms of that whole luxury boom was just totally speculative, and the banks, everyone was just on some kind of, they were just on some construction frenzy, all of this luxury housing. And so then everything collapses, which we all, I mean, anyone could have foreseen, basically. And somehow then all of the affordable deals, which are, you know, we always tell private developers, I don't want to say risk-free, because there's no such thing as risk-free, but if you could think of something as you know, much less risky, okay, there's lots of, there's no lease-up risk other, you know, than, you know, slight timing issues with approving people. If you have good contractors, there's no little construction risk. They're still getting the same guarantees and LCs that they, you know, et cetera. And so kind of to throw the baby out with the bathwater in this environment is just, I think it's peculiar. You know, the banks should take a look at what HPD is doing, which is taking it as an opportunity to figure out what's worked and what hasn't, and keep what worked and throw away what hasn't, or change that, as opposed to just saying no to everything, because it is hurting our neighborhoods, it's hurting the pipeline, and there's a lot of lending that could be going on out, you know, or continues, you know, but again, we'll see how it goes. But they're so nervous around deals that a level of nervousness that is not necessary. You know, we're fine with the due diligence, et cetera, in this environment, but the level of no and closed capital markets. And then again, so the stuff the state's doing, what HPD did 30 years ago to come in and start up the market, the stuff HFA is doing right now is that kind of thing that's going to stimulate so that the private sector hopefully will start to get comfortable again. I think they should be comfortable on their own, but this stuff's going to be, you know, but this stuff's going to help.
Okay. Timing-wise, do you want to open it up to questions, Andrew? Okay. Take the first question. Yeah.
Excuse me for not standing. My name is Eleanor Bailey. I'm from the Coalition for Mitchell-Lama Housing. We keep talking about the word affordability. I would like to know what do you consider income level for affordability? Now, I remember reading an article about our income level for housing was set utilizing Westchester counties, Nassau County, and New York City for what we consider income level for New York, for the people of New York City. What is the income level for affordable housing?
No, huge range.
Right. Obviously, that's an important question, and we, in a conversation up here, sort of throw that term around. So the two answers. The technical answer, which is affordability is measured as a % of the metropolitan region, and you're quite right, Westchester and Long Island used to be part of it. I don't think they are part of it anymore. Now, they've changed it. Now we got part of New Jersey. I don't know if that makes any... Right. I'm not sure it makes any more sense. But I think the point of what you're saying is that, and I know the three of us, because we've talked about it elsewhere, we actually mean there are multiple levels of affordability. So the low-income housing tax credit is at 60% of that metropolitan area. That's like $60,000, so that's like $1,500 a month. Rent or something like that, $1,200.
Lower than that.
Yeah, 12, all right.
Well, it's a little low, 56.
Right. But it's roughly that. But everybody would agree you need, there are homeless people, so we have programs where people have no income. We need a program for people who are at 30%, so half of that, 60%. And the city's housing program, I guess we can say for Rafael, does have different programs to focus on different income levels. We probably could have a conversation about what's the right distribution here as to how much of the city's program should be at 30%, how much should be at 50% or 60%, how much at 80%, 130, 165. But it's just important to realize, since I'm doing sort of the economics part of it with Martin here, the lower the income you shoot for, the more subsidies required, so the fewer units you can do. So there is a trade-off here, and the city tries to figure out what the best distribution is. There is no single number for affordability.
But our projects in development, and that we've done recently, might range in what income you need to make from $15,000 to $60,000 on rental projects. The city has programs that might, maybe as high as $200,000. There is a range. Part of it is the federal government's programs are much more narrow. The city's done, I think, a good job of expanding that. There's been, efforts to get, the tax credit program to expand to a wider range. So if you do some above 60, you can do some below and average it. That would be a tremendous benefit to New York City, because it's very expensive to finance units at 80% and 40%, but it gets you to the same average.
Right. So, in fact, some people said that the low-income housing tax credit, which is the major federal housing program here, all goes targets for people at 60%, or actually 50 to 60%, that band. And so we may actually have too much housing like that. And also, I'm a complete supporter of the idea of go for 60% maybe being the average, but do some at 40, some at 80, whatever, because I think that having a more mix of incomes of people in the same housing is probably beneficial to everybody there, rather than building, for example, all low-income housing here. So a number of us have been pushing for a number of years for more flexibility in the federal program, but right now, you hit 60%, that's it.
Thank you for the question. Yes.
Hi, I just had a question. I was interested in the conflict that you mentioned that arises between having unionized jobs and local jobs, and how that applies to our definition, which we really haven't defined yet, of supply of housing, and if that means supply in terms of built physical form and construction, or if supply means access and who has the access to, live, own or rent housing. And then, so my question relates to what do you guys think of the idea of a sweat equity program and how that could be, in theory, having capital investment and, the concept of cooperative ownership coming out of, physical labor of folks who live and work in the area already. How can that program, is it feasible beyond a theory, and that it's been used in different circumstances throughout the city's history, and how that applies to this value of neighborhoods?
And
Good question.
I happen to be the director of the Mutual Housing Association, and we have over 350 units of housing, and many of those actually had sweat equity. It was a different time. It was a very different economic time. And, but I can tell you that the folks that did sweat equity have a stake in the build. They do not own these buildings. They're part of a mutual housing association. They can't sell them. The rents are extremely affordable. They are responsible for some very basic maintenance, cleaning, and we do everything else. And they're very proud of their buildings. It is not perfect. Their kids grow up. It's, there are issues. But it is a model. But what we have found more recently is and the reason I say it was at a very particular economic time that this happened. If you heard Mark and Martin talk about credit markets, it's like when you add, a component which is now, whether it's for insurance reasons or for, bank, the credit issues, it's just hard. We've brought it back up. Habitat does some of it, but they would be here and they would tell you how hard it is themselves. So I think it has worked. It takes a huge amount of oversight, and it takes a certain kind of environment, a supportive environment, both the bank environment and the agency environment, to allow that type of model to kind of come back into play.
And would likely cost more. It doesn't save money to have the sweat equity. It likely adds cost to have people doing sweat equity. The main value is then their investment and personal commitment into the building and maintaining it.
The
cost
of
of construction.
Yeah.
Meaning that, with the complexity, when the habitats model outside the city, when you're doing single-family wood frame houses in rural parts of the country, without our building codes and all the complexities, the sweat equity might add more value. When I ran East New York Urban Youth Corps, and we had all these youth job training programs, and we had the construction, and obviously it was a perfect opportunity to weld the two, and we talked to our general contractors about how much would you discount if we give you this army of kids in our training programs, and it wasn't how much they were going to discount, it was then the negotiation was how much extra were they going to charge us to have all these volunteer laborers. And I think that is the challenge you have, doing electrical work or plumbing work. So volunteers can come in and do some sheetrocking and some painting and maybe some framing and some other things. but the amount of supervision and oversight will cost more, it's just going to add costs instead of saving money. I don't think Habitat would disagree. I think there's, they make people when corporations want to volunteer with the Habitat, they have to pay for their volunteers.
Right, I know.
Thank you. Next question over here.
My name's Blaze Rustal. I want to focus on the banks, and Mark, I think, can address it first. I think responding to your point about leverage, right, that housing is a good economic development tool. It's a good use of public dollars. Primarily because of the leverage you get from private capital, you end up getting a return back from tax dollars, right? That was the argument. I'm amazed that the banks the economic crisis is really they're at the center point of it, that from a national policy perspective, I think we haven't talked a lot about, we just brought it up, CRA and the low-income housing, the Community Reinvestment Act and the low-income housing tax credit, which are both directed, the Community Reinvestment Act is directed at banks to make investments into neighborhoods and affordable housing. And the problems in the low-income housing tax credit market are because all of the investors, 2-3 years when this started to escalate, were all financial institutions. There are no other investors who are buying tax credits, and so now you have no other investors except for the banks. So the banks play a critical role in affordable housing, and we've given them hundreds of billions of dollars, and we're not forcing them to put money into these things. Not only is it not a lot of, there is less risk than a lot of other things that they're making investment in. The government's putting money in. I think the whole program is great. We focused on the city. The city's been doing a good job. This city has done an unprecedented job in the amount of financing programs and innovation that it's created. It's the best, one of the best in the country. But the banks need to step up to the plate. And I think the banks really, I think Obama has an opportunity right now in regulating the whole financial system to address affordable housing as part of it. And so I want to know, I mean, you're one of the leading researchers on CRA. This is an opportune time. I mean, if we miss it here, we're missing a big, big time. So what do you think needs to be done, particular for Community Reinvestment Act, to get banks and more financial institutions, even non-bank financial institutions, to put private capital in? Because that's what you said is what makes it worthwhile for the government to make the investments in it as well.
Right. So I think you've raised like 3 or 4 different issues. So one, just a factual situation. Unfortunately, with the low-income housing tax credit, you can only take that, get the credit if you're otherwise paying taxes. It's not refundable, right? And there's some discussion about ways to create more flexibility. So a lot of banks aren't paying taxes for a while, and Fannie and Freddie, which were 50% of the market, aren't in the market at all anymore. They're not earning any profits, but they got a lot of other problems as well. So what's happened in that market is that the previous investors now are either totally out of it or way reduced what they're putting into it. And that shows the difficulty with something like CRA, because the reason all the financial, that most of the investors were financial institutions, most of them being banks, is because CRA gave credit for that, and they were willing to accept a lower return than a non-bank would have found acceptable. In fact, Warren Buffett has been an investor over time. There were Chevron, there are other industrial companies, oil companies, who found the market attractive until the banks were paying such high. The measure here is how much they pay per dollar of credit. They were up in the 90s, and by some calculations over $1 because of K1 losses, some technical stuff there, made it unattractive for others to be in the market. Now when the banks pulled out, there were no other investors that understood the complexity of this market, and so you actually got an unintended consequence of CRA. It worked well when encouraging the banks to do it, got very favorable terms. In this environment, you actually got the flip side of that, and so you have, other than in New York City, you have way too few investors to do that. So there are two very large topics, and I don't know how much we should spend on them that go to the core of what you're asking, which is, are banks lending today? And by and large, they are overall. What has happened is there was a shadow banking market, the securitization, the secondary market, that's completely disappeared. So while people think banks have pulled back, and maybe they have a little, their portfolios are stable or growing in terms of the amount of lending they're doing. The problem is there was a whole other world that was out there lending. And as you, obviously from your question, what banks are lending to or have stuck on their balance sheets because they can't get rid of them are not necessarily what you would like them to be lending to at this point in time. So how you deal with that all financial, it's slowly being worked out, but in the meantime, the baby is being thrown out with the bathwater. I agree with that. And I don't know how you make the banks do things that they would view as uneconomic. That's a problem. Well, you didn't give them that. You gave them the capital to do that. They're still supposed to go out and, I mean, a lot of people have the view that banks take risks. Banks have never taken risks. In retrospect, they've done foolish things, so they did. But the bank, if you ask them, would say, no, what we do, we manage risk, right? So the idea is we take your deposits, the money you put in the bank, and supposedly the banks would then would say that, you know, we then invested in an intelligent way. It turned out they weren't very smart in a lot of what they did, but they don't knowingly go out and invest your money in something where you're not going to get it back. So they think they're doing the right thing by their depositors and by their shareholders at the current time. I don't know how the government goes in and says, you know, if the government really knew what to lend it, it should just give the money directly for whatever housing it wants to. It doesn't need the banks to sit in the middle of doing that. And no one's saying you should give the money to the banks so that they go and lose it. So you have to, you have them in the middle, and they're making judgments here that you don't agree with, but I don't know how you change that. I think that's very hard. You need the whole financial system to improve. As far as CRA, you are correct. That is the main work I'm doing at the Ford Foundation. I think you're going to have a separate session on that, if I'm not mistaken, at some point on CRA, and go into that at length. But I think CRA is 30 years old. It started with the idea that there was redlining. It's changed a little bit over time. The banking industry has changed a lot over time. It needs a really serious look here in terms of providing, not just saying banks, you've got to do something, but also providing them positive incentives to do the right thing. It's not very helpful, I don't think. It's not bad, but it's not very helpful that they get desperate periodically and say, I got to go do 10 loans, and you got to do them in this certain date. I'm not sure we've ended up in quite the right place where we all would agree that we wanted CRA to bring the sort of mindset of financial institutions to see the opportunities of lending in low and moderate income communities.
The only kind of benefit I've seen is that with the institutions that took TARP money and then had to become subject to CRA, that's the only new influx of new money. So Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, you know, so that's the only silver lining. But so obviously CRA gets them to do something, but it's a question for our federal elected officials on why was not more asked. But there is the silver lining that we have some new players that are helping prop up the tax credit market a little bit. So.
And fortunately, they're located in New York. So
yes, fortunately, they have a local market.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank the panel for answering our questions.
Everybody.
And thank you all. Appreciate it.